Okay, welcome. Good morning, and welcome to my basement in Oslo. It's a nice and chilly day. My name is Dan Bannock. I am a professor of political science here at the University of Oslo, and I'm also the academic director of the Democracy Hub of Circle U. This is very important and influential European University Alliance that the University of Oslo and all the other universities, the other nine universities, are a part of. And we are particularly delighted that we are having this webinar at short notice. And thank you for joining us. And I'll get back into I'll come up with some of the practical things very shortly. This is being organized by the Democracy Hub of Circle U at the University of Oslo, but also with Aarhus University. I want to particularly thank Lotte Skovberg and also Bella Reed for helping organize this. And so let's get started. Before I introduce the panelists, I just want to reflect briefly on 2024, which has been a very eventful year for many reasons, but perhaps not the whole of 2024 as much as November 2024, because we've had the US elections, which I'm sure every one of you have been following. And then we've just had these climate change negotiations that have just ended COP29. And the world looks pretty interesting these days. There is a lot of discussion on how the public views climate change. There are issues related to facts and misrepresentations and fake news. We don't have snow yet in Oslo, which is becoming a big problem. People are, I suppose, every day being bombarded with information either way about whether we should be worried, whether there is hope, and what's next. So our focus today is basically to talk a little bit about these processes that we have, these debates we have at the global level, these agreements, and then what really happens when people go home, when politicians sign on the dotted line, and then they have to go back and sell it to their citizens, and not least to find the money. It turns out finding the money is often very, very challenging. It's easy to promise something. It's totally different to actually deliver on that. So is there hope for substantial action? And just to remind us, there are three main issues. There are actually lots of issues, but three overarching issues that COP29 focused on. One has to do with transitioning to renewable energy. That has been a very core focus of these negotiations. Enhancing climate resilience has been important, but also securing equitable climate finance, which has got perhaps the most attention in the media reports. What can we expect realistically to happen when we move forward? To discuss this, I'm joined by a fantastic panel. And we have Dr. Anais Auge, who's a research fellow at UCLouvain, the University of Louvain. And I have to say that all three have said yes at very short notice, so I'm extremely thankful. And we have Dr. Antoinette Fage-Butler, who's an associate professor at the School of Communication and Culture at Aarhus University. It looks brighter in Aarhus than in Oslo today, Antoinette. And then we have my very own colleague from Oslo, Dr. Solveig Aamodt, who's a political scientist and senior researcher at the Center for International Climate Research, CICERO, here in Oslo. And you, the audience, are welcome to interact, send us questions, comments, and we have our colleagues who will alert me to your questions and comments, and we'll try to allocate 10 to 15 minutes to go through these when that time comes. So before we dive in, my fellow panelists, into COP29, I want to start by asking you to please reflect on this public trust and mistrust on climate science. Where are we? And I want to begin with you, Antoinette. What is it that we can say about how we in Scandinavia, the rest of Europe, how do we view the science? Do we trust it? And I'm asking this because even in my country, Norway, there are lots of people, apparently over 50 or between 50 and 60, who are climate deniers. And these are often educated people. So where are we, Antoinette, on this trust and distrust in relation to the evidence on climate science?
Thank you for that great question. I think it's very difficult to be overall kind of general on it, because there are so many different contextual issues, cultural issues. But I think it is maybe a bit remarkable, as you point out, Dan, that we actually are doubting science. So there are some individuals who are groups who do that. When the science is very clear on the real dangers of climate change, there are well documented a lot of researchers in climate science and the natural sciences working hard at this and providing us with a lot of information, and also documenting new issues like the Atlantic flow, the AMOC, and how this will impact us here in Scandinavia, in the Northern Europe. So maybe it's an extraordinary thing in itself, we might say, that there is this mistrust. On the other hand, we can also understand it maybe because it requires the impacts of this reality of climate change will require great changes of us in society. So it requires us to do major somersaults, you might say, in our behaviors. We need to reinvent how we go about our lives. And I think that is maybe the sticking point. And I might mention actually Mette Frederiksen, who was interviewed. She's the Prime Minister of Denmark. And she was interviewed while she was at COP. And she reflected on the fact that Danes are very supportive of climate change generally. They're very concerned about it as well, overall. But she also pointed out that before she embarked on major changes and major demands of society, that she was a little hesitant because there is this electoral cycle, which means that if the public reacts negatively to them, then of course there will be issues, as in the next election she might not, or her party, or those she collaborates with might not be voted in. The other parties might, and there could even be a stronger polarization on the issue. So I think I understand the issues for politicians on this, who convene at COPs and have to negotiate this tricky situation, which is political for them, but also think about the longer term implications of a sort of a hardening of mistrust.
Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned the politics because I've been thinking quite a lot about this, and we have a research project looking at better understanding how politicians actually understand the science, and then the extent to which they feel they can act on it. So the cognitive abilities, the willingness, as you said, Antoinette, I mean, politicians can go to climate change negotiations and with all the expert opinions, etc. But to come back home and sell this to an audience that may be willing to make sacrifices outside their countries, but not within their countries, right? So we all like to say, oh, it's great that other countries are doing it as long as it doesn't affect me. I wanted to ask Anais and Solveig to reflect on the politics. And Solveig first. One thing is, of course, when I'm in Oslo, when in Scandinavia, in Europe, thinking about these issues, when I hear my students tell me there's a lot of interest in degrowth and major changes to how we consume things, right? Where we get our meat and coffee from, etc. And then when I go to the global south, some of the major countries like India and China, Brazil, the debates are very different. But Solveig, as I understand it, it's not like they're not for this climate science and climate action, but their priorities are somewhat different, aren't they?
I think in all countries you can find different priorities, and this is also what Antoinette was talking about, that politicians have to prioritize issues. And if this climate is not on the top of the list of voters, but schools are, or healthcare, then you get a different priority. And especially in Norway, where we have this huge oil sector, then it's a very difficult political move to say that you're going to reduce economic growth or go out of something that's profitable. So it requires a quite bold political move. But I think in the global south, the climate question has always looked differently. So for us, we are at the standard of living that you have in Europe. It's about reducing emissions. So we're already at the peak. We're going down from the emissions that we have, and the focus is on doing that without reducing welfare. So that's the question. But in the global south, the question of growth, the question of increasing welfare for a huge amount of people has to be tackled at the same time, as this is not supposed to increase emissions. So they have to have a different development path from what we've had in Europe. And this is what they point to usually, that the question for us is primarily about development. It's not primarily about reducing the emissions. So tackling these questions at the same time, I think it's equally challenging and even more challenging, because you have so many demands and so many legitimate demands from the population in different areas. So it's also dependent on finance, that I think we will come back to, that it's not possible for all these countries to invest in renewable energy and all these things, and also to adapt to climate change without having help from the global north in achieving those aims.
Yeah, and I think, when I read the reports, because I'm never at these negotiations myself, but when I read the reports, it seems that one area of agreement and disagreement is who is supposed to do what and how much. And that's where a lot of the global south feel that most of the efforts to curb emissions, Sulva, as you were saying, should take place in those countries that are traditionally polluted, and they have to pay. And it's time for them to pay. Anais, I want to bring you into the conversation. If you can reflect generally on in this politics of climate negotiations, and particularly from the Belgian perspective, perhaps, since you're at Louvain, where you can reflect also on the public trust, mistrust, but the politics of climate. Is there support in Belgium, by the way, for these kind of negotiations? Are people talking about it at Louvain?
At Louvain, yes, definitely, because it's the academic sector, right, which is a bit more informed, especially because I work in the School of Political Science. So yeah, this is one of the main themes that is addressed in universities, definitely. Then, in the context of Belgium, I'd say it's a very complex question, because we used to have a very huge public interest back in the 2019, for instance, where the Green parties won several elections. They had, governmental power. But then, other social issues, I'd say, came into the public debate. And so the climate crisis lost the public interest. And so now, I think in Belgium, the point is to regain this former interest. Then again, I wanted also to discuss the points you mentioned about the Global South, because actually I give a lot of workshop and courses on perception of the climate crisis in the Global South in comparison with what is experienced here in Belgium. And what I find interesting is that when you sort of force, it's not really force, but when you talk to people, to Belgian people, about what is happening in the Global South, then they can easily relate to their own experience. And I think this is a key to raising the public interest by showing them that what is happening in the Global South can happen and will happen in the Global North.
Yeah, so that's a very important point, because if you say that this is something happening very far away to people who live very different lifestyles, you can't relate. So there's something about making a persuasive argument that that doing something out there will actually help you, back home. I think that that is the most, that's what I think people realized during the pandemic. It was not just about ourselves. You can't just close borders and prevent the pandemic. It has to be stopped at its source. But let's get to the nitty-gritties of COP29. What, according to you, wonderful panelists, were the major milestones? If you can sum up and tell me one or two key things that you felt was good, that was achieved at COP29. Antoinette first.
Well, thanks very much. I think the new collective quantified goal is an achievement, although it needs to be said that it was less of an achievement from the perspective of many nation states and developing countries. So it is at least, I guess, an outcome. Because it looked at one point like there wouldn't be an agreement on how to fund climate adaptation across developing countries. So I think it's an achievement. I mean, there are always huge challenges at these COPs to get agreement, to find multilateral agreements across so many diverse interests. So in a sense, it's too little, far too little in relation to the money that is needed. And figures like $1 trillion US dollars was actually quoted as more realistic. So it's improved from $100 million to $300 million, but still it's a billion, sorry, and it's still a fraction of what is required.
Yeah.
So I think I say it's an achievement, but I also I know it's hardly anything to be happy about. At the same time, it's too little. And I think that it will be up again for discussion, because there is so much dissatisfaction and a righteous indignation about the lack of support, solidarity for countries that really are suffering and realistically right now also going through some really challenging times. So that would be. I'm very ambivalent about it. I think everyone is. I think it's an improvement from a very, very low baseline, and it needs to be higher.
Thank you. That is the sort of the headline, right, from the events, and it started with 100 billion on the table. It was tripled to 300 billion, whereas the figure, as you just said, by an expert group had come up with a report earlier this year saying 1 trillion. I will go back to this slightly later. I want to bring Anais and Sulva. Anais, what is your take on the main sort of milestones achieved?
So I was thinking about that, and actually I've got two milestones, but are very different. So the first one would be, okay, from a practical side, I think it is good that they started to discuss ways to check that the countries who need to receive money do receive the money, right? Mm-hmm. So I was glad to see that this was on the table. Then again, of course, the practicalities, well, they can be questions, right? But at least I think it's good that the Global North does recognize that the money that they did promise years ago was actually never received. So that's a good recognition. Then on a more communicative side, right? I was also glad to see that the issue of climate justice, so climate and social justice, became important. Then again, practicalities, they can be questioned. I'm very, very skeptic in terms of how it will be realized concretely. But I'm glad to see that in recent years, these questions have been major themes addressed during COPs.
Excellent. And we'll return to this. In particular, I wish to discuss with you, Anais, the role of civil society in promoting this climate justice transition. We'll return to that. COLvain, your take on the major outcomes?
Yeah, so I agree with both the formers. I'll try to say something else, but I think a COP, yeah, there's a lot of attention to the finance goals. So I think we'll get back to that. But I think what was actually agreed on the first day was some nitty-gritty rules for carbon trading. So that's actually something that they achieved, and it was, yeah. And this is something, I mean, the COP has lots of negotiation tracks, and much of it is quite technical and nitty-gritty and back and forth. So some of those issues were solved, and I think that's important because it enables us to move forward, at least in some areas. And I also think on a more political side, from following the COPs for several years and maybe paying particular attention to this issue coming from Norway, is that this oil production is getting more attention. So oil producing countries, and countries like Norway, like Azerbaijan, like Saudi Arabia, that earn the large parts of their income from oil and gas, it's on the agenda. It's criticized more openly, not only by civil society, but also by other actors. So it's not, we didn't really get any further. Even we got a bit further in Dubai last year, and then this year they weren't really willing to commit anymore on this issue. But it's something that's there in the agenda, and it's out in the open, and we talk about it. And it's also going to be addressed when countries have to make new national contributions. So the national contributions that countries have to submit under the Paris Agreement, they're supposed to submit new ones in February. So it's something that's talked about, and I think that's good. It's a progress on that side. But although there was no new agreement on phasing down or out of fossil fuels.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to all three of you for raising these issues. Indeed, there are some achievements that do not get or make the headlines, like this rules for a UN-backed international carbon market, but also reducing methane and other non-potent CO2 greenhouse gases. That was also an agreement that was reached. So those are. I want to address the elephant in the room in many ways, which I'm sure was an elephant in the room of negotiations. That is Trump's victory. Do you think that played a role at all in the negotiations? Was it always looming in the background? Anybody?
I might just, I think it was a huge elephant in the room, as you say. And I think that I feel that there was some concern to get things over the line this year because things might be more challenging next year. I think that was an issue. So let's try and get an agreement because things may be challenging in the future. Yeah.
But I'm thinking it couldn't have been easy for the American negotiators, right?
Oh.
I mean, whatever they say it will not have the kind of credibility because they know there'll be a new administration next year, right? So it's very difficult. But I do see that maybe there was this feeling that let's get as much done this year. But I wanted to, and we can talk about the politics later on. But what do you guys think of Solveig's point about the fossil fuel industry, and countries that, like Norway, that rely on oil, and we of course export most of our pollution outside. We sell our oil other places when we're driving electric cars here. So there's that. That's also an issue, and yet we are, of course, from Norway, from Scandinavia, very interested in championing the case of climate finance, etc. I'm asking this because last year in Dubai, but also this year, there were all these allegations that fossil fuel companies were making deals at the climate change negotiations. Right? I mean, that is a paradox. But and I'm sure this happened. I think the chief negotiator was accused of doing this in Baku. Solveig?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what happened in Baku, but this is the whole COP has become sort of a fair for all kinds of interests. So last year it was 100,000 people that traveled to Dubai, and many of them had nothing to do with climate negotiations, nor were civil society. So it's a huge how do you say, networking place, and also a place where you can meet, of course, business opportunities, and many businesses go there to showcase both green solutions, but also not so green solutions that are not maybe displayed that much, but there are lots of meetings, and it's I guess it's an opportunity for many companies, smaller companies as well, to meet the larger ones. But I just want to go a little bit back to the Trump issue as well, because I talked to the Norwegian chief negotiator yesterday, and he said that the Americans that were there, they were negotiating for Biden. They were representing the Biden administration and negotiating to get a good deal, as good a deal as possible for the current American administration. So I think for me, what may have been inspired by Trump's victory is that Argentina withdrew its delegation from COP. So the Argentinian president, Milei, he's a huge fan of Trump, or at least he made a big effort to travel to the US to be the first state leader to greet Trump after his victory. So that may concern me a bit more, that this Trump effect might spill over to other climate skeptic or climate, or not in state leaders that are not interested in prioritizing climate. But I hope that that's not the case. But yeah, I'm a bit more worried about that, because climate policies in the US are quite business driven currently. So it's not that much fear that Trump will turn it totally upside down at home.
Well, if I were to put on my optimistic hat, I would say that, given that Elon Musk has become there's a bromance between Trump and Elon Musk at the moment, in terms of renewable energy, in terms of transportation, in terms of electric cars, Trump's the fear that Trump would backtrack on all of this, maybe you can be a bit optimistic. It won't be that bad. But if you were to put on the pessimist hat, he can do what he wants, and whatever he thinks will make America great again. And there it would mean going back to coal. It would go, ramping up oil production, and you may end up next year already seeing very contradictory policies. On the one hand, promoting renewable energy, on the other hand, doing the opposite. And I think that is going to be a big challenge, because the US is the second largest polluter. The US has traditionally been the biggest, right? And what the US does has an impact. And if the US pulls out of all these international agreements and negotiations, it is going to be pretty difficult for the rest of the world. Not impossible, but pretty difficult. Anais, you want to reflect on this?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, I sort of agree with your optimistic hat, because I was thinking, and actually this is something I was thinking also during the first term of Donald Trump. I think if we want to be optimistic, I don't want to shock people too much, but I think Trump's election has something positive in it, in a sense that it would be like an alarm for people you know, in the rest of the world, to realize that, yeah, this is what the public thinks. This is what the public votes for. This is who the public votes for, you know? And, well, there's a reason behind it, right? So I think the fact that this election came as a shock is also good to realize that, you know, public opinion is not always very progressive. It's not always in favor of climate adaptation, etc. So I would tend to be optimistic in terms of international agreements. Of course, then the US is, you know, as you said, it plays a major role. But then again, I think we also need to take into account that there are other countries that do play a major role as well. But we do not really see this role because these countries are much smaller than the US. Yeah, and I think it's important as well to take this into account.
Yeah, good point. I was in China a few months ago, the first visit after 4 years, and I was amazed at, you know, some of the debates that were taking place internationally and how those debates were being interpreted very differently in China. And this is could be of particular interest to you, Solveig, because one of the debates had to do with overcapacity, which was something that the US has been pushing through, saying, and this is where the geopolitics comes in, right? So from the Chinese perspective, the fact that solar panels have become really cheap, and they're producing all these very affordable electric cars, which is a lot cheaper than the German cars. By the way, the German auto industry is in huge trouble because the Chinese cars are taking over. So from the Chinese perspective, this is all good. This is good for climate. This is good for sustainable development. But the US and increasingly the European perspective is, oh, but they are competing against our industries, and we're going to have layovers. So it isn't just price, it isn't just availability, it is also about our welfare. And then the picture gets very fuzzy. Then suddenly people are saying, it's not just climate that is the goal. It is all kinds of other issues that must be satisfied. And this is where all three of you have been talking about. It's the voter, the domestic consumer that has to be convinced that whatever's happening is also good for their welfare. They're not going to lose their jobs. But and we can return to this, but Anais, I wanted to ask you something that Solveig mentioned, that these COPs are becoming the meeting point of all these interest groups, right? It's the new Davos of, I don't know, making a business, and which could be good, right, Antoinette? It could be good for people to meet and interact and do deals. It could be innovative, etc. But Anais, I wanted to ask you about civil society, because I know you've worked on Extinction Rebellion and other groups. I wonder how visible, how present are they at these negotiations? Because for me, Extinction Rebellion is very present in our daily lives, you know, the sensational protests, etc. But do civil society actors really get much of a say in these negotiations at the COPs?
I would say they get a say in the countries in which the COP takes place, and then in the media in general. So, for instance, I actually myself attended a protest during COP26, which was in Glasgow. And it was a huge protest. It was all around, you know, the place where the meeting took place. And we received a lot of media attention. And I think it's the case for every COP, right? Obviously, I can't attend all the COPs, but yeah, I think they take part in a sense that they are present. They might not attend the meeting as such. Of course, you do have activists, quite a lot of activists who, you know, speak during the events, sometimes not so much in terms of I'm part of this association, but just I've got this experience and I want to share it. And I think it's really good. And it's also good. Well, you mentioned the greenwashing of some societies, right? And I think it's good to have this true actors, like having a say during the meeting. And if I can add to what has been said, is the positive point. Again, I'm being optimistic, but the positive point is I think that civil societies tend to get more attention than these societies trying to promote their environmentally friendly activities, etc. I think so.
I think that's a very good point you mentioned. Where the COP is held has a lot to do with how active civil society is. It also applies to World Cup, football World Cups, etc. Suddenly the media isn't welcome and you can't say anything like, in the previous occasion. And there's been a lot of discussion as to why Dubai and why, Baku and, Antoinette, how do you think the location of the COPs play into our public perceptions? I'm asking also because, Sulva, isn't it true that we did not have our prime minister attend this COP? And so you begin to wonder, is it like some COPs attract the world leaders and high-level delegations and some don't? This one did not. It seemed to be somewhat, like in UN terms, always high level is good, high level this, high level commission, but this COP seemed to be a bit more medium level.
Thanks, Dan. You're right, and I think there were many people that were missing at the table, which was obviously not good. Biden wasn't there, but his representatives were. There were people that were missing, and I think it has a lot to do with public perception. In that regard, I was really fascinated to see this open letter on COP reform, which highlights the problem of location. So this was written by some excellent signatories: Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, Johan Hagström, Ban Ki-moon, and Mary Robinson, amongst many others. And they point out the real challenge in having holding COPs where countries are not interested in phasing out or transitioning from the kind of carbon fuels. So it is a huge issue, and I think that needs really to be considered, because it makes the whole thing seem rather paradoxical. I mean, why there? And they also point out that they just picking up on what Anais said about representation, that there was a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists in the COP28, which of course, there's outrage amongst many about this. Why are they having such a strong representation? And they argue for more equitable representation. And I would say definitely young people need to be more involved, have a stronger voice, throughout the whole of these debates about climate change. They're the ones that are inheriting the problem. Their voices have even more weight, or should carry more weight than I believe fuel lobbyists should. Yeah.
If it was up to me, I would say all the COPs should be in the countries that are the lowest emitters. It would be countries on the African continent. It would be small island states. I remember, was it Mauritius? I think there was this wonderful cabinet meeting that was held underwater a few years ago by the Prime Minister. It has to be where climate change is
for sure
the hardest. It should not be in these fancy capitals, or there's always this element of whoever's hosting wants to brag about it's like a tourist promotion thing. We organize COP just like the Olympics. But let's talk about, and since we have like 21 minutes left, let's talk about the most important issue, or one of the key issues that got a lot of attention, which is the loss and damage fund, which is now called the new collective quantified goal. I can't remember this. Loss and damage was a lot easier. And historically, as we alluded to earlier, and it was about the global south and countries that have traditionally not been the highest emitters, saying that those countries that have become rich or are rich today have historically emitted the most, and they should take the major role in providing funds for adaptation. They should be taking the major initiative for mitigation efforts. We are not, the global south will say, we are not against these, but we don't have resources, and you have to pay for causing damage, loss, and damage. And that was the rallying cry at many, many COPs before Dubai, where, promising noises were made last year. Or was it also maybe earlier? I don't remember. And there was a long and elaborate process of devising a mechanism for ensuring that rich countries put money in, and then how that money would be used. Now, one of the debates I've had with our Solveig, our former Minister for Climate, who is now our foreign minister, had to do with this. And I've asked him things like, why aren't we putting in more money? And he said to me a couple of years ago that it isn't that we don't want to, we're not stingy. It's like we also want to make sure that the money that is provided is spent well. Do countries have a viable plan? And this is something I've heard at many sort of European capitals, that the developing countries, the global south, just want money without really showing us that they can spend this money in a proper way. Solveig, what do you think of that argument?
Well, I think that's the general argument in development aid. Like the argument from here, are we sure that the money comes to where what is it spent on what we wanted to be spent on in this issue, discussion of corruption and accountability in these issues. And I think on climate finance, there's the constraint for maybe not that much for Norway, but most European countries is that you don't really have that huge amount of public money to spend. So you want to draw in private money and finance. And Norway wants to do that too, but and then it's much more sexy to finance reducing emissions, so mitigation, than financing adaptation or loss and damage, which is more, it's not, you can't really take a picture and show a great result on your company webpage in the same way that you can with a solar panel or an installation. So for the and of course developing countries know this, and that's why adaptation has been put so high on their agenda. And it was a big victory. I think it was 2 years ago in Sharm el-Sheikh that loss and damage was finally recognized as something different from adaptation. This has been a major issue. Norway was not seeing it as something different from adaptation, but for the global south, G77, it's been a big issue. And I think you have the NDCs now, you have the national plans. So there you have a plan for what the finance is going to be spent on. But you can't just pour money in, and there are all these on the ground issues as well, that okay, we can roll out renewable energy, but you have the land conflict issues that we looked at in India, for instance, and you have you risk by just giving money that you're just increasing the inequality that's already there. So it's there are lots of issues on how to do it in practice, but I think from the European perspective, this loss and damage issue is also we have never recognized that we're the responsible one for Europe, and for the US. Loss and damage is not compensation. So just going there to acknowledge that, yes, we are to blame and we have a responsibility. That's something that the developed countries could have done without any cost, but it's a political cost to make that, to admit to this. And I think as long as we're not willing to do that, we're always going to be blamed for doing things in our way and not listening to what the needs are really and demands coming from the south.
That is a good point, because it has to do with accountability. If you accept blame, then you're held to account, and you may be held to a higher standard. And the fear is that then it'll be just people will be asking for compensation left, right, and center. It'll get out of control. But Sulva, I also liked your point about development aid and that analogy, because often it is about absorption or absorptive capacity. You can give a lot of money, but is there a public admin, a public service that can absorb it? Is it going to be used properly? But it could also be used as an excuse not to give anything. You can always say there's corruption, there's always mismanagement. I'm sure we have so much research evidence on what works in public policies, how they can be designed. So, it can be used both ways. But I do see there's a valid point, and I'm sure, like many years ago, the World Bank started introducing these PRSPs, poverty reduction strategy papers. That was one of those efforts to get countries receiving money from the World Bank to come up with a viable strategy. It was another matter that a lot of these countries ended up hiring international consultants to write these papers for them. So there was very little local ownership. All of these things we know can be avoided. But Antoinette and Anais, let's bring you to the conversation on loss and damage, this new collective quantified goal. Antoinette, you said, very rightly, this expert group had said we need 1 trillion. 100 billion was promised, 300 billion is now on the table. But when I read some of the reports, there's a lot of doubt as to how this 300 billion will be counted. Is it taking money away? A colleague of mine at the Center for Global Development in Washington, Charles Kenny, wrote a piece a week ago saying what he fears is development aid will be taken away and put under this climate finance aid. So you may end up having the same money being used differently, and the fear is there won't be new money made available. And that's one thing. The other debate has to do with the private sector. There's often this idea that the private sector, this billions to trillions transformation will take place. And colleagues of mine like Charles Kenny are very skeptical. So Antoinette and Anais, first you, Antoinette, what do you think about this? I mean, is this even the 300 billion, even though it's not as much as 1 trillion, will it actually come to fruition? One thing is to promise, another thing is to actually deliver on promises.
You're absolutely right about that. And I can't obviously be sure of what will happen. But it is also a long-term sort of wish by 2035. But I think there's a lot of we have to have a plan. I mean, there needs to be a sort of some goal, and I think that's at least an achievement that comes out of this, because there is this accountability factor that comes in. That okay, have you done this? And I think that's one of the things that I note about COP, is that it is also about being responsible, taking charge, showing accountability, and sometimes even showing leadership, as happened in the UK when Keir Starmer also talked about the reduction in greenhouse gases, which are in line with the Paris Agreement. So yeah, what will happen, I can't be sure, but I think it's important that we have these concrete goals at least, and then of course, and then check up. I mean, how are they going in reality?
Thanks, Anais.
Well, I fully agree with what Antoinette just said. But I was thinking also to go back to your previous question about how the money would be used and could be used. I think it's also important to realize that this money is needed, and I think I was thinking of this project that I had, I think it was during COVID in 2019. I was in Brazil. And I was working with indigenous communities there. And we realized that they actually needed solar panels just to keep, animals, snakes, viruses away from their houses. And so we started to raise funds in order to install solar panels, etc., etc. And I think, when you talk about this to European people, like, yeah, indigenous communities, they need solar panel. Then they have this idea that no, indigenous communities, they live, in nature, in the forest, they don't really need technologies. Why would they need technologies? And so I think, yeah, we need to communicate more on, what the money will be used for, and to give like some concrete information. And of course, it's not us, the public, to decide, how much money will be used and how it will be used, etc., etc. But I think, yeah, the main problem here is that actually people in the global north are not listening to the people who actually need the money. I think this is the major issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a request for the audience. If you have any questions, comments that you'd like to share with your questions to the panel, please let us know in the chat. And my colleague Bella Reed is monitoring the chat and will make me aware of any questions. If you don't have any questions, that's also fine. I have lots to talk about in any case. So we still have around 9 minutes. One thing I wanted to ask all three of you has to do with the private sector, because that's another, apart from Trump, it's also the private sector that's been an elephant in the room. And some of the debates have to do with finance, that maybe the global north, the rich countries, are sometimes encouraging, in a positive sense, the private sector to play an important role in climate efforts, whether it is in terms of renewable energy, it is anything that is climate smart. But the criticism is always, or often, that there is not always a need to subsidize the private sector, very expensive subsidies. The private sector should be doing it on its own because it could be, a profitable thing to invest in climate friendly technology, etc. So the criticism is that sometimes the public sector, the taxpayer, is subsidizing the private sector for doing things that they should be doing on their own. That's one thing. The other thing has to do with, there are unrealistic expectations of how much private sector revenue can be mobilized for climate finance. And this is a big problem in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, just unrealistic. And yes, the private sector has played an important role, but it has been largely disappointing. Solveig, any thoughts on the role of the private sector in climate finance?
I could talk about this a lot, but there's a one challenge that the private sector points to is the risk. So the risk of investing in Africa, for instance. Africa has, as you all know, lots of sun. Only 1% of all solar power investments globally are currently in Africa. So there's a huge need. And then the private sector points to that countries don't have sufficient financial institutions, banks, and all these issues, and then it's more expensive. Yeah. So they need a higher profit. There's a higher risk. So that there are lots of projects where countries, for instance, Norway or India has the International Solar Alliance to mitigate that risk of private investments. But that's usually an argument, and also our own Norway's oil fund is investing in renewable energy, but mainly in Western Europe. So it's also the public, like even the oil fund don't want to take the risk. So things can be do with mitigation there, but I think we need to realize that it's going to cost us something as a society. Like we can't keep growing. This idea that economic growth it's going to continue, that we can solve everything with technical solutions. I think we need to understand that that's not really possible. There's a huge societal transformation that also has to happen, and it's difficult to communicate. And I think it's difficult to say that okay, maybe we need to make less money. Maybe we need to have. So it's always the whole solution of the problem that's created by this economic model that we have is going to be solved by the same economic model. And I think there are some fundamental questions that we're not really digging into. And I also wanted to say that for the former question about the trust and what's going on. I think that the response measures that especially Europe has put up with the CBAM and also the US with the Inflation Reduction Acts on new border tax, it's been received quite negatively by the developing countries. So this is an issue that's also going to come up in the COPs, like this trade between countries, and that we're protecting our own market and producing for our own market.
And there's
I'm just throwing that out. I know it's
that's important. And in fact, there's a particular thing that has happened this last week or so. The Adani Group, this Indian big private sector group, he's one of India's richest people, invests heavily in the United States on renewable energy, huge renewable energy projects. But the Adani Group has been indicted in the US on allegations of bribes, etc., being paid. And this is going to be an ongoing case. But there are now fears in the US that when you have this indictment, then this group, this private sector, is not going to invest. And that's going to push, a lot of these original investments back. So we are not just talking about private sector within countries, but also these multinational companies. And that's where the geopolitics comes in. Chinese companies doing business somewhere else, and Indian companies, etc. I've of late, particularly this year, I said it's been a very interesting, very eventful year. But I also think for our students in CircleU, the European University Alliance, it's important that we just don't talk about doom and gloom. And I sometimes feel that climate change talk is always invariably negative. And that most of the attention is always about, what is bad. We don't talk about what is achieved. And one perhaps not very scientifically proved yet discussion is the faith we have in technology. Because some people say, don't worry, that's also very simplistic. We have AI. AI is going to solve everything. That's one thing. But if you were, the three of you, to give our students, our colleagues some hope, and rather turn this doom and gloom to something optimistic, what would you say that we should be focusing on? Anais, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I would again focus on what's happening in the Global South. In some countries, did you have the solutions? Did you know how to live and thrive despite the crisis? And I'm using crisis as a plural word. And for them, they know how to live with it. So it is possible, even if we reach this stage of the crisis that they have in the Global South, it is possible to without money, without technologies, to go through this and to find solutions that are climate friendly, that respect, inequality, social justice, etc.
Thank you. Antoinette?
Thanks for an excellent question. I think you're absolutely right about this doom and gloom. And of course, we hear about the risks of climate change, and they're well documented. But we also, as Anais and Solveig pointed out, there are positive stories as well. And we need to turn up the volume on these. And in fact, I think there is no other way. We have to have a focus on optimism, that there is that stubborn optimism that we need to have on this topic. And that means also encouraging those positive stories and giving them a volume, encouraging those, because if we don't have optimism, then there is no, there's nothing to aim for. So optimism is absolutely fundamental, I would say. And I know Christiana Figueres has said similar things. I just really think it's absolutely right that we need to be to have a sense of perspective. Obviously, we can't just be optimistic and leave it at that, but also that there should be a baseline of that motivating us going forward.
Thank you. Solveig, 30 seconds.
Yes. Two small things. First, civil society engagement helps. So civil society engagement, both in the global north and south, has moved policy. And second, we have more policies, climate policies globally than we've ever had. So policy trajectories some years ago moved us towards 4 degrees warming. Now it's 2.9 or 2.7. So it's going in the right direction. So it's some things have improved quite a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. All three of you. Fantastic. It was really fun to chat with you. Thanks to Lotte and Bella for helping organize this. And if you're interested, we'll put this, of course, out on YouTube. If you're interested, we did a Circle U open conversation earlier this year in August on the politics of hope. So we link that too. If you're interested, you could have a look. So thank you, Solveig, Anais, Antoinette. It was wonderful to chat with you. And thank you, the audience, for taking part in this. And we'll see you at the next event. Wishing you a fantastic weekend. Thank you and bye-bye.